Welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Are the stars out tonight? I don't know if it's cloudy or bright.
Well, back at it again. New episode here. Going to be talking a little bit about pietism. Pietism. You know, we started talking about that a little bit, I think 2 episodes ago when we played that message from Jared Longshore. About 3, you know, where we go from here, we got 3 options: separatist pietism, defensive evangelicalism, or reformed Kuyperianism. And we said, you know, what we want to do is definitely, no matter where you land, I'm not sure which camp we're falling in yet fully, but we definitely don't want to be in that first camp of the separatist pietists. Unfortunately, I think that's probably the camp that has the most influence on all of us. Like, it's the water we swim in, it's what we grew up in. If we haven't been trained otherwise, that is
Pietism.
Pietism,
Pietism.
especially the way that it's influenced us and kind of led us to where we are in this cultural moment. You know, you ask questions like, man, how is it that the church, that we didn't, you know, that we seem to have allowed ourselves to be marginalized to an extreme degree in the past, 5-10 years, whatever it is. But it was actually, the seeds were planted for this long ago, and we had already really been set up for it. And it's just the logical conclusion of this kind of long march. And so going to talk about that today. Before we jump into all that, if you can subscribe, if you're on YouTube, it just helps us, to let you guys know every time we get a new one. If you can also, just, we love to hear from you guys. We're getting some comments, some emails, and we get to interact a little bit more and kind of share some of the resources we're using, just some of thoughts. We maybe we'll do a Q&A one up here soon. We'll pull from some of those, but I got a few comments this week from either YouTube or on our Patreon channel. We also still have Patreon. If you do want to partner with our ministry, we have a link below, either in the podcast or on YouTube. So feel free to jump on that and, help Nerva get the new diamond earrings. Just playing. But no, I gotta brag on her today because, my wife, she's got like a full-time job. She's doing full-time school. Now I have a job too, but like after my job, I get to come and actually like listen to this stuff, read these books, but you're like, you don't have much time to follow along with me in this
along
journey
for the
right
ride. Y'all know that.
Well,
no,
that's not true though. You're studying worship, theology of worship, full time as a student.
Courses.
And so, but we're not doing that topic right now. We may do that in the future. I'm excited. Like we were talking about the potential of maybe doing a series on what is biblical worship, and then I'll just be tagging along on your trail that you blaze. So, but I still like her to be on these episodes because I think it's good as a litmus test. Like a lot of this stuff you're hearing for the first time. I've been swimming in it now for months or even
I learned so much.
a year
it's
or two.
Awesome.
So I want you to just talk like, man, like, give it to me because it helps me to know what some people,
no, just kidding.
well, some folks on the other side that, like me a year and a half ago when I was hearing these concepts for the first time, the thoughts that would have come to my head and that I've since forgot. Because, you go down that trail long enough, you're into the woods, you forgot like the first, a few miles of what it was like to be on that trail. So, anything that pops up, just shoot it out there. It'll help me. But
Okay.
Right, no but anyways, I appreciate her stepping in and doing this. And like I said, we started doing a Sunday school class with some of our Patreon folks, where we were going down a little bit of this road that we're going to try to cash out a little bit more in depth in this season. So pietism, I think, is one of those important, it's like one of those things, like once you hear it described, you'll be like, oh yeah, I totally, in a murky way, that's kind of what I've thought over the years in many cases, but something about it when you make it explicit doesn't sound quite right. And
Gotcha.
So you're like, okay, that maybe, yeah.
And when I hear that word, I think of like the monasteries or like the old 1800 cathedrals or things like that, but I'm sure it has a different definition.
It's related to that. It can be related to that. I think that even preceded what we're going to be talking about specifically today, but it is part of, I think, a common theological stream. And I think it's one that has made it if I had to say, man, what are the things that have led us to disengage our duty in the American evangelical church in the realm of politics and culture shaping? I think pietism is one of the top 2 or top 3 theological, I guess, positions or ideologies that have contributed to that. And so I think it's important to really understand what it is and understand, like, okay, which parts of it are true, are parts of it not true that we need to get rid of, or parts of it actually keeping us from, walking in the fullness of what God has called us to do. And I would say, yeah, I do believe so. And it was really helpful to me to understand what it was and where it came from, where it was leading to, and why so many of us felt like, I don't know how to engage with these things, or we just need to not engage with these things. So we're going to spend maybe a few episodes really just kind of hitting this time and time again, come back to it, because I think it's really important for people to be able to understand it, articulate it, and just analyze it from a biblical perspective. So there's a movie we watched. We bought it a few weeks ago, I guess. I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, called Enemies Within the Church. Yeah, really good. I highly recommend it. If you just go to emmyswithinthechurch.com, I believe it's I don't know, you can get it for $13 on digital. It's worth way more than that. But they really talk about this, just what has happened in the evangelical church with regard to these. And they have a section on pietism that I thought was really good. So hopefully they'll let this go through on YouTube without any problems. But I'm going to play just a little piece of this movie to kind of whet your appetite here and give you a little bit of background on pietism.
My grandfather was taught that clergymen should not meddle in politics. My father was taught that clergymen should not meddle in politics. I was taught that clergymen should not meddle in politics. My father and grandfather were mostly obedient to the ideas of Christian pietism, but to their credit as good men, not always. Pietism, a common doctrine of the Western Church, has taught multiple generations that clergymen should never address the cultural controversies.
So let's just, if you can still see that, pietism stresses personal devotion, internal holiness, and inward spiritual experience at the expense of an outward legal expression of Christianity in society.
Okay.
Any thoughts come to mind on that?
Personal devotion, internal holiness, and inward spiritual experience. So there's an emphasis on experience.
Yeah.
At the expense of.
Yeah.
And he mentioned you'd never ever get involved in cultural and addressing any of the cultural issues.
Yeah, and that's a fruit of at least the way this part of pietism. Now, if you do a more thorough study on pietism, you'll probably recognize that there were good elements to it as well. And so I think, I don't have a ton of scholarly knowledge on this, but just in the little bit of study I've done on it, I believe there was a high emphasis of scholasticism in Germany at the time when they're going to talk about the founder of pietism. But when this was going on, scholasticism, basically this approach to Christianity, super highly intellectual, theological rigor, which is good. Great theology, being rigorous, being precise, being biblical, all that stuff. I'm a huge proponent of that, but almost to the degree that it pushed out a warm fellowship with God and other believers, almost to where it made it you disagree on this one thing, you're a heretic, we're tossing you out the church, and almost just out of balance a little bit.
Overemphasizing.
Yeah, overemphasize.
No,
so sometimes when people mention scholasticism, it is kind of this extreme view of just over theologizing to the point that you become just one dimensional, and that's the only thing that Christianity is. And I think there was an element of that after Luther in Germany that had become kind of dominant. And so the Pietists were sort of reacting to that, and they were wanting to recover this warm fellowship with God, and this man, I really want to experience him, not just know about him. And so I think there were parts of that that we might actually appreciate and agree with.
For sure.
But like anything else,
the scholastic part or the
both,
yeah.
but I think in this case the pietistic reaction,
for sure,
there was probably some needed correction to scholasticism.
If you want to grow in your confidence and knowing what you believe and why you believe it, if you want to ground your faith in biblical Christianity and step into who God has called you to be, I want to tell you about a great program put on by Impact 360, and it's called Propel. Propel is a 1-week transformational leadership and discipleship experience where high school students gather together to be grounded in a biblical worldview as they learn how to follow Jesus, have a godly influence, learn how to disciple their peers, and boldly live out their faith in their daily lives. So they're having 2 sessions this summer. The first one is June 19th through the 25th, and the second one is June 26th through July 2nd. These programs fill up really quickly, and I promise you, you will not be disappointed. So we'll put the link below if you're interested in looking into it, and we'll see you this summer.
But I think anytime you have a correction to an extreme, there's always a temptation to swing that pendulum a little too far. And any
good thing to the extreme becomes a bad thing. It's like you start out with, yes, I want experience God, and then you start chasing experiences, and that's all you begin to care about. Or the other part as well. So
there is that human tendency toward being out of balance, right? And sometimes sometimes you have like something that's extreme, like a good thing gone bad, and the reaction is all bad. But I think more times than not, when a good thing has gone bad, the reaction will be sometimes a good thing that goes bad, rather than a completely off base thing. And I think pietism is like, it wasn't like a straightforward, like heretical movement from the top, but I think it carried a lot of things with it that were less helpful, and then some things that were really damaging, and we're just now really experiencing the results of that in our culture. So again, it stresses personal devotion, internal holiness, inward spiritual experience, and this is the key phrase here, at the expense of an outward legal expression of Christianity society. That's not the only thing to pietism, but that is a major part of it. It was like retreat from those, those culture wars, those kinds of things. So I'm going to continue to play on from here.
Much less the legal and political worlds which naturally flow downstream from that culture.
Pietism essentially is, we take Christianity and we boil it down to the personal. It's all about me, myself, and I. We should have absolutely nothing to do with civil government matters. And it stands in utter contrast to historic biblical Christianity again, which said Christ impacts every area of life. Frank was very strong on missions. But on this matter of our relationship to civil government, they were deadly wrong. Somehow, this teaching...
So I want to pause it there just to catch that real quick, if I can rewind it there.
Okay.
Frank. So they're calling him the Lutheran theologian and Bible scholar, August Frank, I guess. He was the founder of Pietism. Now, this is important because sometimes we can have like historical myopia, right? Or just this view that like we think because we grew up in this certain thing and it's been very popular in America, that's been like the history of the church. But what this pastor here is claiming, I forget his name offhand. We're going to come back to him because he's written a couple really helpful books about Romans 13. But what he points out is actually I guess the view that was more popular throughout the Christian church, and historically speaking, was not Pietism. Okay. It was actually very involved with this thing. So while it feels like foreign to us to question Pietism was actually more of a Johnny-come-lately theology than it was the historic Christian position. And so let me see if I can find that here again. Yeah, so August Frank, that was the founder here.
Civil government matters. And it stands in utter contrast to historic biblical Christianity again, which said Christ impacts every area of life. Frank was very strong on missions. But on this matter of our relationship to civil government, they were deadly wrong.
So he's strong on missions, which is good, right? Mm-hmm. And you can see why. Like there's often in pietistic circles, there's an emphasis on reaching souls, saving souls. And so mission work can be good. But mission work is usually defined or narrowed to evangelism in that sense. Maybe some form of spiritual growth, maybe helping families, that kind of deal. But that's pretty much the limits of where it goes.
Somehow, this teaching came to King Frederick, and he immediately began to put the pietists, as they were called, into important positions of teaching in the universities.
They began to have a theological construct which basically taught passivity. It taught compartmentalism.
So passivity and compartmentalism.
Yeah.
What does that remind you, the compartmentalism? What's the most broad compartmentalism that still flows through our culture is that of sacred and secular.
True.
So the pietism is thoroughly subscribes to that view of sacred secular. Okay. And they have a really narrow version of sacred.
And that's like everything you do in the name of ministry. Clergymen and pastors and teachers are sacred works.
Yes.
And everything else is
those are the important
okay,
things.
Those are gotcha.
You know, if like it's some, you know, they'll even say, "Oh man, why would you go into, you know, politics or even you know, law, movie making or something like that?" That's it's just earthly, it's worldly, it doesn't really, you know, amount to much, because the mainly or sometimes even the only thing we should be really concerned about is souls.
You deal with what you deal with, and we'll deal with what we deal with. Hitler's famous statement to the Church of Germany at the time was, "You just be concerned with the souls of men, I'll take care of Germany."
Yikes.
Right. And now we hear that same thing echoed. You know, Hillary Clinton, for instance, she loves pietism.
Okay.
Because what pietism often does is it gets the people who are conservative, because they, you know, in many cases we have been taught, you know, basic biblical principles, and we understand how that underlies many conservative principles like the right to life or the right to property. Those things are grounded in, you know, broader biblical principles. So you don't want those people getting in your way politically. So if you can push them out of the way by tempting them with pietism, they call it, you know, she'll often talk about worshipers, you know. Yeah. Oh yeah, we want to have Christian worshipers, and you can worship. Actually, Obama used to say that all the time. He very intentionally changed the language from freedom of religion to freedom of worship. You see how that moves it in their minds, because they're defining worship again as basically what we do at church, what we do in our own private lives.
I see.
So getting rid of the influence of biblical thinking on politics so they can bring in their statist ways. So Hitler was, you know, he wasn't the only guy doing that. We're seeing that in our own times.
For sure. Okay.
And that was the fruit of pietism. It was the ability to sing louder as the trains rumbled by, carrying Jews to execution.
While Hitler was busy constructing his tyranny and his evil, Christian ministers of Germany were giving a wrong interpretation of Romans 13. They were saying that Romans 13 teaches that we are always to obey the civil authorities.
And we're gonna hit that one hard too. I think we're gonna do maybe 3 or 4 episodes down, but I just want to introduce that here because that also ties.
Wow.
Also goes hand in hand, often goes hand in hand with pietism. It's like, is Romans 13 a carte blanche, obey the government?
Okay.
And typically pietists will say, no, it's not carte blanche. It limits it if they tell us specifically you can't preach the gospel. That's the only thing we're going to buck on.
Only thing. Okay.
Yeah, but that's actually there's much more to Romans 13 that needs to be said, and so but I'll let this little bit play here.
See that the agenda of the statist becomes the agenda of the Christian, because they're easily influenced because they're not anchored to the law of God anymore.
Authority, the idea of authority, is established by God. It doesn't mean every person in authority and everything they're doing is established by God, and that you are somehow duty-bound to obey them simply because they happen to hold a position of authority. In fact, I think we have a duty to rebel against authority, as our founding fathers did, when that authority is unjust, when that authority is trying to turn us into slaves of man rather than being children of God. And there's a responsibility to stand up against it, and sometimes even violently oppose it. And if that weren't true, then it was morally wrong for us to fight World War II. But it wasn't. It was the right thing to do.
Now that's a whole nother topic,
that
right?
Is.
This needs a little hard to paint.
Wow. Yeah.
So, but that was the argument, and we're going to come back to that. Like, what was the argument of the American Revolutionary War, and was it justified, or were they doing something unbiblical?
Mm-hmm.
I believe someone like, I could be mistaken about this, but I think John MacArthur, for instance, would argue that the founding fathers were out of order for rebelling against England and using violence to do that. And what if it was okay, was there a difference between that and the French Revolution? And then what does that mean for now, for us now, as the state is increasingly growing and growing? Like, what are we saying? What do we do with that? How does that relate to Martin Luther King's non-violence?
Nazi regime, all of that.
All that. So these are questions, you know, and this is honestly
interesting.
Why we're doing this podcast. I wish we were just learning this in church more often. And some churches are. You have some that are stepping up, and it's massive, and I love that. But by and large, I haven't noticed a lot of people breaking down the doctrine of the lesser magistrates in the past year, where that should have been like one of the primary topics we were going over as the government is doing this, you know, everything they're doing with the COVID, you know, draconian measures and all this kind of stuff, and just running roughshod over, you know, fundamental human rights and all these kinds of things. We're left without answers. So we're going to adopt the answers in most cases from, you know, CNN or MSNBC or maybe Fox or wherever we're from, but not have a rigorous theological discussion on it. And hopefully that's what we'll be able to provide here. So
if the state commands that which God forbids, or forbids that which God commands, we are to obey God rather than man.
None of us would dismiss the reality of a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But when it is sealed to only affect my personal ethic or life, that's when we begin to get into trouble.
It's no accident that the first communist revolution was in Germany in 1848. Karl Marx grew his movement in Germany, which had been neutralized. The politics were ripe because of Pietism. And when that revolution failed, many thousands of German communists moved to the Midwest of the United States, to Milwaukee, Chicago, etc. and would have.
So you can see how this all connects. And so this influence now, you know, the idea again of pietism, the inward, and so I think how that gets expressed will vary from church to church. You'll have some that are hyper focused on just
experience,
like
personal.
Experience, personal, like, you know, in the better cases scenarios, they'll include like sanctification and discipleship on the personal level, and they'll talk about the spiritual disciplines and spiritual formation, and maybe even extend that, like, how does this affect your family? Your family should be functional, and then maybe at most, like, we got to build a church that really embodies the kingdom of God. But almost no pietist that I know would go beyond that. Like, that's the limits of how Jesus is. When we say Jesus is Lord of my heart, maybe my family, hopefully my church, and that's about it.
I wonder how it plays out when family and the definition of family, quote unquote, becomes a cultural thing and is trying to be redefined by culture.
That's a great question.
And how pietism would address that. You know.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the issue is like people like me, I'm not from the background. The guys that did Enemies Within the Church are more reformed, like Douglas Wilson, some of the people we've been appealing to that I think are hitting it right down, you know, right in the money. It's because they understand the history of just Reformed Protestant theology better than I do, where I come from. Now, I appreciate a lot of my background, and you know, it makes us who we are, right? Sure. And I'm so thankful to the many godly men and women that poured into me. But what I didn't often have was like this kind of rigorous theology in these areas. And what began to wake me up was the assault on the family, because I did know, even as like someone from a charismatic background who valued apologetics and theology, I didn't understand all of Christ for all of life, but I did value those things. And so when I saw the LGBTQ agenda coming through like it was, and then what they were doing with it politically, that was what began to wake me up and say, is the state allowed to do this? Are we, as Christians, are we called to just kind of like, do we just, the more they spread out, am I supposed to go into the corner more and more and just get out of the way for the sake of souls? Or are we actually supposed to push back on on their turf? And if we do, what does that look like? And that kind of I think that has led many separatist pietists who didn't know they were separatist pietists like myself into defensive evangelicalism. And that's better. Like I said, at least they're getting in the game, and you're waking up to the fact that, hey, no, actually, there was a reason that Jesus was crucified. Is because when you say Jesus is Lord, it was a political statement. It implied that Caesar was not. And so everything they were forcing on them, they were saying, no, and it's not just, that we're not going to preach the gospel. There's more to it than that. Why were the apostles, killed? It wasn't because they cared. It wasn't because they had their own private worship. They wouldn't have cared about that either. Most politicians throughout history are happy for you to have your own private worship. Mm-hmm. It's because that worship, Christian worship, extends to all of life. And because they were applying that, inevitably they came into conflict with the powers that be. And so, when you begin to pull on that thread more and more, it becomes apparent that you're like, oh, wow, there are some answers here biblically that I just have never thought about before. Wow. So I think it's a great question. And I think that attack, they went too far in their attack, and they started attacking the very nature of God's creation and human being. What is a male? What is a female? What is a family? We want to destroy the nuclear family. What is marriage? And you see the assault of those things that no longer could we afford to at least uncritically hide in our pietism.
Yeah.
Because,
and then during quarantine, I think many families saw via the Zoom teachings and how their kids were being taught what they were being taught, and their eyes were open for the first time. Wait a minute, this teaching, it's not what I agree with. A lot of Christian families were
for sure
really taken aback to that. So that's
a great point. Yeah. And that's another thing that even them teaching the LGBTQ radical stuff to 5-year-olds, we've talked about that in California, and laws against, conversion therapy, and then adding the CRT to that, teaching these racist doctrines of critical race theory in school has awakened many parents that had just mindlessly, again, had their kids not knowing that these things are just the tip of the iceberg of what's been going on for years. And because I went to public school, and it took me many years to climb out of that indoctrination. I almost lost my faith, I think, because of those seeds that were planted. And the key here isn't to go back to the 90s, and think, oh, that was when everything was good. No, that's when we just didn't know how bad everything was. And that's why we're going to do episodes on education as well, because there's a whole system going back to John Dewey, who was just an ardent atheist who was trying to put through atheistic principles in the education all the way back to early 1900s that many parents just weren't aware of, that we were already being indoctrinated in such a way that at best we would have to hold our Christianity over here as like a sliver of privatized faith that I just hold to that helps me get through life. But when it came to science and math and English, that was all going to be secularized, and those were the only things I could know. Yeah. And so anyways, all this stuff is...
And why should secularism prevail in the education system, especially when it's a matter of not will we serve God, but what God...
Exactly.
will you
not
serve,
whether but which, right?
Yeah, not whether but which. Okay,
and
gotcha.
And so, no, you're exactly right. So the lie of secularism was the neutrality piece.
Okay.
And that's why, that's why we need to go back and again, I think a lot of these Reformed guys think there are people waking up in every denomination, every branch of Christianity right now, thankfully. But I just think these guys, it's like there's a quote from a famous, was it Jastrow, this scientist, who said, for many, many years we climbed up through the ignorance of man, scientists, and we, leaped over that last cliff. I'm doing a terrible job on this quote, but he's like, we pulled ourselves over there to see, and basically in discovering the beginning of the universe he was talking about. And he said, we pulled ourselves over this cliff of ignorance to realize a band of theologians have been sitting there for years.
Wow. Okay.
This is me, as a kind of a charismatic Wesleyan. I'm lifting myself over this cliff to realize there's been these Reformed brothers have been sitting up here on this mountain talking about this stuff for years. So they just have a lot of time-tested, thorough, clear ideas, and that's why I kind of keep pulling in from their material. So, hey fam, sorry to interrupt this episode. So we started this episode and we got done, it was like an hour and 20 minutes and it just felt super long. So we're going to make it super short and put the rest of that episode on a separate file. So it's going to be a Patreon episode on the audio end, but you don't have to be a Patreon. We'll have the link below. You could just click on it. It'll be an unlisted YouTube thing. So we just want to do like a little bonus episode, make it into a bonus episode. It's kind of, we talked through this article on John Piper's Pietism and how it came to play in the 2020 and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's an interesting one and a good one. We just didn't want to keep it attached to this because it just felt long. So check that out below, and we'll see you next time when we talk about more Pietism.